You're going to see me talk a little bit about developmental findings as well as classroom-based kinds of implications in my research. One thing I will first of all start with is I work with what is a philosophical stance called the intentional stance. It comes from Daniel Dennett's work. And out of that, I like to work with dynamic systems theories, which really incorporate environmental kinds of elements as well as variable-centered kinds of elements into thinking about person and situation interactions. As Daniel Dennett and many others define intentions, we talk about the combination of beliefs, desires, and actions. A lot of us in this room take this stuff for granted, and so I may be a little quick with some of the front ends. But because we've been listening, I want to do a quick show of hands first, okay? When you look at this picture, how many of you can think of human rights or some civil ideas when you look at that? Okay, not too many, yeah. How many of you think about this in terms of a cause, a particular cause or something that you might stand for? How many of you, when you look at this symbol, might think of that? Not too many. How many of you think of this as a personal issue, something tied to your own sense of well-being or anybody? Okay. Anybody know what this symbol stands for? This came from Guadalajara, Mexico in March. And it is actually an earthquake safety symbol that is everywhere in the city. And so what we did was, I spent a lot of time looking at how do youth look at the world and in terms of civic causes, society at large, and their personal issues. When I did the similar show of hands in Mexico, I saw nobody got the universal thing, and of course we spent a lot of time in Mexico trying to figure out what kind of human rights message could be tied to this symbol, right? And we came up with the idea of inclusion. There's no symbols here that say certain people are welcome, other people are not. The arrows point in toward a center, so we were like, yeah, inclusion, here's a human rights issue. When we looked at causes, what happened is people use this actually in Guadalajara as a meetup space. So if they're, and right now Guadalajara has a lot of protests, both violent and activists of the more socially constructive type. But they use these symbols as a meetup place. And so when I did a show of hands in Mexico about what might this symbol mean to you, and I said, how many of you can think of a cause? They didn't agree on the same cause, but they mostly raised their hand and said, this is where we need to start supporting causes. And then when I said, how many of you know that this is think of personal safety, very few of the audience members knew what this symbol was in fact put everywhere in the city for. It's on walls, but in fact it's an earthquake safety symbol that says, in the case of an earthquake, these are safe zones where you don't have to worry about power lines hurting you, okay? So they see it as a political safety zone. My work looks at how do youth come to understand these different dimensions in society. How do they come across or imagine a public life and a private life? And for Division 15, I'm putting the school cast on it. And of course, all my work is done in schools, and so that's not a twist. How can schools help adolescents and young adults situate themselves in public discourse? And I do this by looking specifically right now at adolescents. My early developmental work really was focusing on at what point can kids really start fully understanding this notion of society anyway. By 8th grade, on some especially basic school issues, you can see that a lot of kids are ready to think about how they might fit into society. And so what I started doing is looking at how do you think about local, national, and transnational kinds of governance issues, especially now that the internet is making it very easy for us to play around with talking to people in other countries, imagining the world at large, and so forth. And so you're going to see in my talk today, I'll talk about a little bit of findings related to personal discourse. I think 90% of the work in Division 15 focuses a lot on personal discourse. My roots, for some of you, we're probably going to figure out, I know a lot about motivation kinds of stuff. And I also look at fairness and how people think about institutional fairness and what's a fair way of organizing particular practices. But personal discourse in my work is really focused around personal well-being, safety issues, but also, achievement issues and a sense of what meaning by character. Civic and civil, I'm going to show you a few findings that will also help you see the difference. One of the common questions I get all the time is, what's the difference between civic and civil? Aren't you just making up different vocabulary words to come across with the same idea? Okay? And so I'm going to show you a little bit of findings that help you play around with some of the differences here. I have, like many of us in big talks, cobbled together findings, data sources from a variety of different studies. And so what I did here was throw a few little pictures to give you a sense of some of the projects I have going. The top row here is part of my Civil Discourse project. I have an Adolescence in Groups project, Facebook project, sports project. Some of our presentations at APA have been about the sports projects. And for a lot of you may know, my main signature is tied to moral development and moral reasoning. So when we think about personal discourse, we can think about acquisitions and again, or activities that promote the acquisition of knowledge about well-being, opportunities for reflection, modes of sharing knowledge, what does self-discovery and so forth entail. A lot of us are starting to think about identity in very broad ways and in more elaborate ways than we have. And what I would say is most of that fits around the notion of personal discourse as well. Consumers of motivation research, and a bunch of us are members of that community, but we're also trying to help others understand what we do. They often hear our references to the self-system as a unitary idea. And what I want to do is show you a few very quick findings that convey my point here that I think that's a little bit of a mistake. That when we say identity is a unitary set of ideas, we're going to miss a lot of subtleties that go along with personal discourse. I'm intentionally using the word discourse, by the way, because most of us like to have conversations about our own well-being with other people. But discourse can also be an internal discourse as well as a dialogue with other people as well. To how I perceive myself related to people's overall perceivability. And so I started, first of all, by taking the most self-focused of the motivational orientations that I like and am familiar with, and said, to what extent is ego orientation correlated with efficacy beliefs, needs, perceivability, and so forth. This data for this talk is just coming out of my sports project, so we crafted items around the issue of athletics. And I'll just let you know also that there's some really strong findings that youth who are interested in sports actually have stronger academic abilities and perceptions than youth who are not. And so I'm just throwing that in to give us a little bit of a classroom variable here, okay? So playing with these data, one of the interesting findings has to do with the fact that task orientation works as a negative moderator on the relationship between perceived or self-efficacy and perceived athletic ability. I asked myself, what's going on there? And when I graph that, I find a really interesting negative incline here that makes me go, wow, what does this mean? And I'm still puzzling over this, so I'm going to throw this out to improve conversation with a lot of you. But what I see is that, first of all, youth who are saying I'm highly task-oriented do tend to have the highest perceived ability. That's very consistent with prior studies on motivation. And then, the relation here with low task orientation and more concern with self-efficacy or confidence kinds of issues is interesting. But this inverse relationship is sort of puzzling. And I'm still kind of going, wow, what's going on there? So replicating that same thing, I get with slightly stronger findings here in this negative relationship when I use perceived academic ability rather than perceived athletic ability. But I'm throwing these out just more as puzzles. I'm going to just alert you to these R-squares are just tied to the fact that these are samples that are very contextual. They're very much tied to context. And I'm throwing really combinations of data that I wouldn't together normally. So I'm interested in building some replications on this right now. And we're also playing with measures that will perhaps, instead of using academic-focused item writing in these, we'll look more specifically at athletic, we'll change these from athletic to academic kind of focuses and see if that, in fact, negative relationship still happens. But you see in this particular study, where everything's about sports, this line becomes even more marked. And so that's a kind of interesting puzzle for us to think about. I like to just say that more to say, to affirm there's some movement in motivation research to say, let's stop looking at samples as holistic populations and start looking at the diversity within samples. And I know that I spend a lot of time looking at ethnic diversity in my samples, but there's lots of other ways in which we can think about diversity. And perhaps what's happening then is we're masking a lot of the differences in how youth are thinking about their motivation. Oops. Am I getting it in the right order? Yeah, let's go in the right direction. Okay, moving on. Who do you want to be is another element of the kind of personal discourse. Schools are full of opportunities for youth to learn more about who they might want to be in terms of vocational potentials. And in our data sets, there we go, got to get my finger in the right button. One of the things we did was ask youth to define at different ages. We gave them different kinds of checklists. For those of you who know something about vocational world, we're talking about Holland's categories. We didn't use the Holland measures, but we're seeing some interesting age differences here in some declines. The realistic category here is really much more mechanical kinds of work interests. But we're seeing inclines in investigative. For a lot of us in STEM interests, we're saying, oh, that's good to see people more interested in sciences and things. The decline in arts fits a lot with the way in which we're not really engaging youth in arts. And so I bring these out just to sort of explore the way youth are thinking about who can I be. In those studies, we just said, what is your talents? In this particular set of answers, we're talking about what kind of jobs do you want? So what kind of career pathways? And one of the interesting things here in this data set is how many youth are undefined. So toward the end of high school, youth are less confident about their choice of career pathways. This is very consistent with other research. It suggests that late high school, early college is a very teachable moment for helping youth figure out possible worlds and so forth. But you'll also notice if you look at the developmental literature, there's a great deal of stability prior to, so in the middle school years and early high school years, and then post the four-year college kinds of periods in how people define vocational interests. But playing with those issues are really tied. So then we just compared the two. Okay, who do you think you want to be? What are you good at, and where do you want to go? And one of the encouraging kinds of things is that most youth are saying, I want to be good at a lot of different kinds of things. And I think that fits with our sense of the economy. We're really not going to take one job in our lifetime. We're going to need a lot of skills. And I think the youth in my studies, at least, have been saying, yes, we understand that. We can't just narrow ourselves to being focused only on what's popular right now or particular kinds of skills. So the third category, and this is where I have a lot more of my work, is sort of around the idea of morality and fairness. But putting that in character terms, we asked, who should you try to be? And for most of us, I do this exercise in classes all the time. I say, write the adjectives for all these different things. And most of us sort of answer the three different kinds of questions. Who am I? Who do I want to be? And who should I be? In very different ways. Youth don't always do that. And there's some really nice age-related trends in how that happens. So I like to, I'm just going to show you really quickly. I'm playing with some measures that Walker and Pitts designed that are basically checklists, adjective checklists. And we ask kids to take, which of these things are important to your sense of character and what you're trying to be. And you can see a bunch of different categories. These are each clusters of different character traits. And when youth say, which of these are important to me and my identity, again, many of them are, more than half of my sample in different age groups are saying yes. One of the really interesting surprises in this is the decline in principle. And so, but what you'll see here, and I've isolated fair here in a different color because for all of these others, there are age trends, but fairness, which is of course my first love, or some of you may have read some of my papers, there are actually no age differences in this. And this fits with a lot of research right now that says fairness reasoning is something that even young kids, very pre-language, have this sense of what is fairness. There's a lot of, right now there's bonobo studies even that basically talk about fairness concepts. I don't always agree with the methodology there, but the idea that fairness is somehow really central to how people think about themselves is kind of interesting. It's a little disconcerting that only, a little less than half the samples generally are saying fairness is something I try to be. But we can actually engage youth in these kinds of conversations. Why is it important to be principled? Why is it important to be fair? And those to me are part of the personal discourse element that could be going on as youth learn, in school, right? One of the very quick developmental findings, and I'm not going to say much more about this, is that most adolescents need solitude to engage in the kinds of reflection that happens with their growth. There's a lot of new ideas that they're juggling in adolescence. Some youth get so self-focused that they have trouble, right? That's where the depressions and all that kind of stuff go on. But the majority of youth, and this is something that I don't think our literature always conveys very well, move well beyond personal discourse. They are not narcissists running around thinking only about themselves at this age. And most of my data focus on these other kinds of societal trends that youth are engaged in. So to help you think about these differences between civic and civil, I'm going to play with civic as a definition that's around the idea of promoting particular causes. We use the word political, and a lot of Americans think Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. Depending on your country, you'll have other categories. But I think a political stance is also your stance on particular ideas and causes that are still, so is sustainability, are you in favor or are you against, and that kind of stuff. I love the fact that the talks this conference had little seeds of civic discourse embedded in all of our invited talks, actually. And I think that youth find school-based curriculum more solid when they can connect it to their involvement in society as well. And so we are playing, and again, this work is, a lot of this is reviewing other people's findings, but identifying and promoting a cause is an important skill of adolescence. Skills of persuasion. How do I convince other people that my point of view is actually worth considering or important or the correct one or whatever, And then skills of addressing areas of weakness and harm. And by this, many youth are starting to think about, society's weaknesses and harm, and where do they want to put their energy, and vocationally speaking, where do they want to spend their lives as future workers. So today we march, tomorrow we vote is a nice little message to remind all of us about the kinds of things. Oops. So I have a colleague, Erica Britton, who worked with Rich Lerner and so forth. I just nod to their work. It's beautifully done at articulating some of the skills that schools can be very helpful in, helping youth define confidence, competence, connection, character, and caring, the 5 C's. And I'll just let you know that these are my civically engaged translators when I was in Guadalajara. They are bilingual and really taught me a lot about local culture in Guadalajara. So you don't necessarily need to get involved in specific political actions to be civically engaged. Just thinking about how do I welcome people into my society is a very strong civic activity. They taught us quite a bit about those kinds of skills. Students in my doctoral team actually are very active, and so some of you know this. I say, I've got 14 doctoral students, and you're not going to see some of them. And I have armies of students that I work with who really are not planning to be professors. They use their higher education literature, they use their research literature to strengthen our public reserves, if you will, learning places. And so one of my students works for the Chicago zoos, so this is Zoo for a Day, zoo director for a day. These are slides from some of his projects. A lot of youth learn about society from participating in museums and other educational kinds of opportunities in zoos. A lot of our students are in the future going to be working not for higher institutions of higher ed, but societally educative opportunities, and museums obviously are very salient. In Chicago, we also have similar youth groups. This work tends to be funded by the National Science Foundation. We're taking blighted neighborhoods in Chicago. We have plots of land that are so toxic you can't grow anything. And they're in the process of regenerating the soil, the land, and so forth, and trying to take that part of the world and make it more nature-focused. There's a great deal of civic discourse that's involved in that. Most of that work focuses on place. So some of you've heard my 3-legged stool about, curriculum, people, and institutions. Civic discourse can take a lot of curriculum ways of helping youth find the activities that they are doing in school. These are actually sculptures. They're hard to see in the pictures, but it's opportunities to bring the arts out into the community as well as the sciences. And clearly the youth are learning a lot about soil development and so forth. So my Mexico team, we call it the Transnational Discourse team, we built a workshop to help folks think about how schools can focus civic discourse and keep adolescents engaged using pretty practical things. We built a school partnership between a high school in Chicago and a high school in Guadalajara. The University of Guadalajara is very similar to my university in Chicago. And so we're now just starting discourse about how can we build transnational partnerships around civic ideas as well. The arts partnerships idea has become really crucial. Fostering critical literacy, not just literacy. So earlier you heard me talking about Bob Calfee's work, and I always get emotional when I have to talk about sad things, but his work on critical literacy is only part of a very rich body that's very salient where I work. Respecting multiple abilities. We try not to talk about students with disabilities in our institution at UIC. We talk a lot about, let's look at the abilities of all youth. And so how can we build curriculum that strengthens the articulation of celebrating youth's abilities? And then because a lot of our communities are really, I live in Chicago, so a lot of things are very transient. We have a lot of families moving to the United States. People ask me, why do I stay at UIC? My favorite story is that 6 weeks after the Soviet Union broke up, my class was entirely full of people whose country fell apart under them. And I could tell them, what's it like to live in a country that just dissolves? Because they had come to Chicago. So we have a lot of immigrant families. So I think in our settings, we should think very carefully about how do we use schools as community centers and so forth to help families, be welcome in our society as well. Civil discourse, the hard part. My earliest work, my passion and of all passions, really is, now I'm using the phrase civil discourse. Early on, I started by just saying, what do students think is fair about life in schools? And I realized, that's got a moral twist to it. A lot of moral development work actually at the time said that youth can't think about these institutional practices until they're late high school or early college. This is Lawrence Kohlberg's work. And then when I look carefully at the questions, they never asked youth to criticize or critique their direct experience with institutions. Those were things that youth would have to add to a lot of the measurements we were using at the time. And so I've done a lot of developmental work to just say, what questions are practical for you? But to give you, before getting you into some of those findings, let me just say, what is civil discourse? I am using work by political scientist Jeffrey Alexander when I play with civil discourse. Civil discourse focuses on human rights at its core. Other civic discourse may use rights talk, they may use, but we also commit a lot of atrocities in the name of, right now, we're in the middle of a debate. We heard quite a bit about APA civil code violations in the Hoffman report. That is a civil discourse issue. We saw some really serious things that we were all shocked to see. Ethics rules that are tied to codes that we value, and we see some violations. So if you remember that civil discourse tries to tie human rights to universal moral principles, and it serves regulative and communicative functions. Okay? So when we talk about codes like the APA Code of Ethics, we can talk about those in terms of where we are, where we want to be, but what kind of rights are we talking about here? Okay, so that kind of dialogue is what civil discourse is about. The argument I'm trying to make, it's very controversial, people have a really hard time, is that schools are institutions of the civil sphere, because schools have the opportunity to promote communicative, discourse about public opinions, about cultural codes, and about social practices. We can argue about these things, and there's a lot of procedures for how do we have those tough conversations. In schools, some of the sample activities, and many of you can think about what classes might kids talk about some of these issues in, right? We can talk about where do people identify and talk about what's a human right, where do they come from, what kinds of areas are in need of social repair. We heard a couple talks actually in our program talking about sustainability questions and things like that. We can talk about things like what policies and procedures are going on in particular institutions and how can they be used to regulate public discourse. Early on I started, first of all, having to verify that kids understand the difference between learning tests and contests. But a bunch of questions as president, I've had this, number of talks lately, are about things like, how come this set of norms is taking over our conversation in relation to that set of norms, right? Learning versus testing. Those are kind of, regulative debates. But I would say that schools are places where kids learn how to communicate about these issues as well. How can we think about the welfare of all people, not just the people in our neighborhood or not just the people we know? How do we think about symbolic discourse? So I open my talk by just giving you a symbol and saying, you know, how many of you look at this symbol and have some meaning, right? One of my favorite activities is to identify symbols wherever I go, and I have pictures all the time. People say to me, you take pictures of signs? Why? And because civil discourse is predominantly civic, or symbolic. You see most of it in what kinds of signs do we put around, what kinds of symbols do we use. Civil discourse involves three things. I'm playing with Jeffrey Alexander's framework here. Relational ties, so how institutions talk to each other and how people talk to institutions. Institutional structures, so you've seen me talk about already learning, testing, contests. What's a fair way to have a learning situation? What's a fair way to organize a contest? Should we have tests? Should we not? How much testing should we have? Institutional structures. And then personal motives, which are, our willingness to engage in civil discourse. Not everyone is either willing or able. So this is grounded in the idea that people form solidarities as they endeavor to build a just world. Civil discourse is comprised of issues of respect, criticism, civility. When I use the word civil discourse, a lot of people right away talk about manners. Most of you probably have a sense of, manners is part of it, right? And we try to look at ways to critique solidarity. So why group ourselves this way as opposed to that way? And I'm looking at Sandra here because I love her propinquity and homophily scores, because that's a way of looking at how are we building solidarities, what kinds of solidarities should we build. To me, that's part of civil discourse. A lot of the work we already know that some youth stay functioning in pre-civil, so they're not even thinking about how they form groups or how their groups have power or how their groups interact with others. And then we all know, and Guadalajara taught me a lot about the struggles they're having with youth and violence, but we see it in Chicago very often, sadly too often. So those are youth engaged in anti-civil. The thing that's important for us to help youth understand is that when you stay pre-civil in how you approach society or anti-civil, eventually you get excluded. Societal norms, structure things so that people who are not engaged find themselves left out in the cold one way or another. I would like to say that schools are places where we can avoid that by drawing youth in. And so one thing I did in this set of studies is ask youth to look at how they might define a civil identity. And this is my definition of what civil identity is based on developmental work with youth in terms of how they understand who they are and what they're ready for. So I try to let youth lead me into particular issues rather than come in with a cause and then teach youth about that cause. But what I found is that most youth have a sense of local life goals. Who does family mean to me? What does locality mean to me? What is my neighborhood like? And youth are starting to form global life goals. So how do I fit in society? What does it mean to be from the country you're in? We're in Canada now. What does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to be, from your home country? But also, how do countries navigate, right? So a lot of global life goals involve how does the world function? And then I use some measures by Claudia Dalbert on belief in a just world. And so what does that mean? That basically means how often do you think of the world as fair and just? This has two components. It has a personal component. Is it fair and just for me? And is it fair and just generally speaking? And so youth actually, in my work, adolescents tend to see this as highly correlated, so highly correlated I don't separate these. I also don't separate the present and future because in adolescence they tend to conflate. Those correlations are very high. But what we see is different identity profiles based on how youth are combining these. So this is cluster analysis for those of you who are thinking about person-centered variables or research as opposed to variable-centered research. And what I've done is put some names here. So people who have a pluralistic civil identity are those who try to balance, not privilege, one type of goal over another. They generally see the world as fair and balance local and life goals. The youth who are more see themselves as community outsiders but are actively civically or civilly engaged are those who try to balance local and global life goals, but they see the world as pretty unfair. And in a lot of my findings, you're going to see only a snippet of this. What we're finding is that these two groups show active forms of civil discourse. The individualistic is really, yeah, the world is fair and I'm just going to focus on myself, okay? Not so much thinking about the world at large. The unformed are really youth who are what we're calling pre-civil in a sense, that they're really not thinking about these questions at all. And most people are thinking about their local, so we don't really have 0 points on that, right? So you're going to see me use these little symbols to help you keep track. It's going to get a little complicated now. Relational ties. To study youth's understanding of relational ties, we played with the idea of social media, and I nicknamed that my Facebook research. But we asked, when youth form connections with people on Facebook, what kind of connections are they thinking about? For today's talk, in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the other focused goal orientations, if you will, or forms. And I'll just alert you to the fact that there's also a very self-focused, I could have put that under the personal discourse category. But when we look at this, what we find is that youth use Facebook for two primary reasons when they're reaching out toward others. This is a little confusing because personal image is very much, some people would say, oh, that's personal discourse. But they're projecting who they want to be, who they are, who they think they are, to a media audience. I like to play with Dan Lapsley's work on imaginary audience and personal fable. We like to project an image. So the personal image measures in our study were based on that. To what extent do you think you have an audience for the profile that you're building, and to what extent are you thinking about, sharing that image with others? And civil discourse goals. And those civil discourse goals, again, involve how do you think of groups in comparison to each other, and are you busy thinking about that kind of thing when you're working with others? We built a little model. The funny thing is we did measure civic discourse as well, and that didn't fit into our model. And so one of the explanations we have is that maybe civic discourse, it's not that youth weren't involved in civic causes, but it didn't really have very much to say about the intensity of Facebook. I put in blue here the important moderators that are really more aligned with the civil discourse, but I just want you to realize that some of these are basic controls that we see. Youth have to be interacting with others. This kind of interaction does tend to go with students who are higher performing relative to their peers. And people who are engaged in the civil discourse element really are sensitive to exclusion. By accident, actually, this comes up with that initial principle I was saying to you. Does that symbol seem like inclusion? Our measures were saying basically how sensitive are you to exclusion, and so those are all pretty salient in terms of Facebook intensity. But again, we have these interesting negative, moderators. And so I want to just give you a quick sense of what some of those look like. These aren't quite as provocative as the task orientation and self-efficacy relationship, but what we're seeing here is the intensity of Facebook use. One of our measures involved how many, we first of all asked them about the qualities of some relationships. 3 close relationships, 3 casual relationships, educators, family members, and peers. And then we said, how many of those people are on your Facebook profile? So this is really looking at that sense of how many people are, I think of this as how many people in my local community are in my Facebook network, okay? And when we say, look at your personal image goals, the relationships here, people with high personal image goals are most likely to use intensity, but these things are moderated in a sense, or affected by the number of relationships that are part of their personal network. That's pretty self-evident. Profile openness is index. This is coming, most of these Facebook's indexes are coming out of user studies on how people use Facebook. They are not indexes I created. But the profile openness is really, to what extent is your profile open to the public and who can see it? Okay, so there's a series of things about who can see your Facebook profiles. But these negative trends, again, are kind of interesting to think about in terms of what am I trying to do when I'm engaged in Facebook. I want to get to this one because look at these trends when we look at the profile openness by Civil Discourse schools. So people who are, and in these studies, we actually asked people very directly about their Civil Discourse goals. We didn't build an identity and calculate this. We just said, how many of these things are you interested in? But what we're seeing really here is the intensity of Facebook. These numbers go down. So Civil Discourse is not a primary reason why youth use Facebook, but it is an obvious one. It's a usable one. It's sort of lurking there. And what I like to say is that youth don't really exactly know what to do. And I think that we as educators, by prohibiting things like Facebook use in schools, aren't really taking advantage of opportunities we might have to help youth understand what civil discourse could actually look like. The general findings from our study is that youth are really using Facebook to express their personal identities. That's probably pretty self-evident. I think of it as a validation, right? We don't have random measures. We have organized measures. But the youth who do engage in civil discourse are actually also thinking about, how they might reach out to other people and what kinds of profiles. So I think we as educators can use Facebook or social media like that to strengthen kids' understandings of the relational ties that they might form with others. Talking quickly again, I'm just looking at the clock here, I have a little timer. But again, I've already alerted you to the fact that I see schools, this is Terry's statement, as institutions of the civil sphere. Jeffrey Alexander, the book I used for a lot of the underpinnings of this, really doesn't see youth as capable. He says basically youth are not capable of involvement in society, and I totally disagree with that. And so I'm trying to make the case here that schools teach skills necessary for participating in civil discourse, and if we don't embrace that, we're missing an opportunity in our schools. They also help youth understand how and why commitments to justice get sustained or dropped. Al Bandura and I have had these conversations about, is moral engagement and moral disengagement, are they conceptual opposites? And what we would argue is no, they're not conceptual opposites, they're different things. We kind of turn off, and some of you may have gone to his talk, which was long and hard to follow, but he's basically arguing that, that moral disengagement really is like turning off your moral compass. And moral engagement requires deep involvement in dilemmas and so forth in order to really stay engaged. And so the mechanisms that, sustain moral disengagement are likely to be very different from the ones that are likely to play with moral engagement. So in some of my writing, you see me use the word engagement as opposed to discourse. When I'm standing outside a community, I think of discourse. When I'm standing with youth in the settings that I'm in, you're going to see me use the word engagement because we're having these conversations. We're learning from each other. Our Division 15 activities are very engagement focused more than discourse focused. But when I ask youth, tell me about an ideal school, okay? I ask them in terms of what in an ideal school, what kinds of procedures should be used, what kind of practices should be used. We play with different kinds of justice here to make sure things are fair. In an ideal school, what kinds of epistemology should we emphasize? In an ideal school, what should teachers do to help everyone sustain motivation? And of course, that's a nod to John Nichols' big, let's create a motivational level playing field. How do we do that? And then teach strategies. And a lot of the cognition people in the room know many more things about strategies than I do. We're sampling these, not exhaustively studying these. But when I ask youth and compare those beliefs, so these identities with their understanding of institutions, what I find is these very strong community outsider and pluralistic identities have actually very similar beliefs about an ideal school. They're much better balanced. They see more nuance. So to score high on these, you really have to reject some things and embrace other things in order to sustain a balanced moral stance. You can sustain a moral stance toward equality or equity or need, but to score high, basically, youth are taking a cause, taking a stance, and carrying it through all the different measures. Whereas the individuals who are uninformed, they're not really thinking about it, kind of a little expedient, but their logic is not very consistent then when they're responding to our measures. And then the individualistic, it's sort of what's in it for me is their stance. Does that make sense? So looking at that, I think educators can have regular conversations about what makes a fair school, what makes our classroom run around moral principles. As we do that, we're teaching youth how to participate in civil discourse. We could talk about it as a cause. When I do talk to teachers, I sort of say, when I'm rooting for my favorite football team, or my school is better than your school, or charter schools are better than private schools or public schools, those are making education civic causes, right? This kind of educational model should be done for everybody, or I'm choosing this particular cause. These questions are around the idea of how do we make education accessible for everyone, and how do we include everyone in educational opportunities, or how do we broaden participation and sustain that kind of participation? So the third element of this model involves personal motives. In my particular work, I'm going around, I'm playing a little bit with some earlier work by the political scientists here, but mostly I'm playing with the notion of the character virtues that you saw earlier. And part of that, again, is there's a lot of the psychology work is starting to think about, let's flesh out character, let's stop assuming that moral reasoning is something different from character and talk about how they might be better integrated. And so you're going to see civil virtues are enacted as human rights sort of stances applied to a person, right? I might aspire to be high in moral character and so forth. I take an Aristotelian point of view and say we can never know if we're really highly moral characters until the end of our life, but we can sustain and say, I want to try toward these agendas as opposed to just ignoring that part of our character or our well-being. So I think we can have dialogues about what kind of person do you want to be, a lot more around the kinds of curriculum that we're studying as well. What does it mean to work in the hard sciences? What does it mean to be an artist? And so when I take those, you remember the character, confident, etc., from the character personal development stuff, and compare that to these civil identities, what we see is that most youth, regardless of their age, obviously, or their civil discourse orientations, they do try to be pretty fair on a bunch of things. But again, principled is this interesting one. It sort of differs big time. There are very much differences. I'm just highlighting the fact that there are age group differences in my data sets, as well as the type of values differ a little bit. So all of these differences are pretty significant. You take pretty strong stances. We could ask ourselves, where do they learn this stuff? Our curricular goals helping them think about this? Are we really examining the ways in which we're helping them? I'm going to show two more quick things. One of the main stances I have, and you'll see me not take a stance on what's the right way to do things as opposed to the wrong way to do things, which sometimes when we talk about character and morality, people really want to simplify that. But to the extent in my research program that I choose projects to engage in and choose projects to avoid, I'm asking myself and challenging myself around the question of how do adolescents balance the competing opportunities to develop and participate in personal discourse, civic discourse, and civil discourse. And can they balance those things, and do they need adult supervision and assistance with that? Most of our developmental work really does say kids at this age need a lot of help with these kinds of things too. But we could also ask ourselves, do adults try to balance personal, civic, and civil discourse as well, right? So I don't really talk about a specific answer, and I just am looking at this going, I got the wrong slides, sorry. But one of the things that in our sports project where we ask kids specifically, straight up, when you engage in sport, how often are you thinking about personal discourse, personal well-being? When you're engaged in sports, how often do you think about civic causes? And when you're engaged in sports, how often do you think about these more universal things? What we find is that most youth try to balance these things very well. And when I looked at our public discourse, I realized that athletics does a really good job of helping the public understand. Like when we talk about the Olympics, and we talk about the kinds of universal principles that those stand for, those are very visible public symbols of civil discourse. When we say choose a team, they're very visible kinds of ways of choosing causes and so forth. And then when we say, how well are you taking care of your body? And a lot of you know I've got a Fitbit, and we're working on the, keeping the balance, right? But, to what extent are we balancing those things? Youth are pretty savvy on that. Compare that to the Facebook findings, okay, where we ask the same kinds of very direct questions. How often do you use Facebook for personal reasons, for civic reasons, and for civil reasons? What we find is that personal image is really their dominant focus. And that's, these are convenience categories based on response rates. Look how low these civic and civil goals are, right? And balance goals, yes, there's still a percent who say, I try to balance all three of those things when I use Facebook. So I take away some very big messages here. I say, first of all, youth can balance personal, civic, and civil discourse. Right now, I don't know that we're lining curriculum up in a way that helps them see the connection between what we do in school and those, important values or that way of balancing things. We do tend to jump very quickly to personal discourse, especially in our motivation research, How do you get yourself through these horrible tasks you have to do so you score high on tests, things like that. I like to think that if we gave kids a bigger reason, a broader societal reason for doing their schoolwork, that we won't really have to have such imbalanced conversations about personal discourse all the time. Yet, if we never have that conversation, we're going to also miss a lot of people. And then I think our communities are stronger when we engage youth. So those neighborhood rebuilding projects are very youth-driven, and they're wonderful to watch, and they're fabulous places to visit. There's one actually in Chicago where there's an abandoned police station, and the city will not turn it over to the neighborhood. And so the kids have slowly but surely gradually built little planters in these abandoned parking lots and things like that. And now it's quite a lush area, even though it's all illegal, right? Not their property, and yet somebody comes in and takes care of those things on a regular basis. That's generated through the arts partnerships in the community, and they're basically seeing, nature and natural causes as a way of promoting kind of the quality of life in our neighborhood. I like to also think about youth getting involved in local governance. Every time we do, I like to think of it as discipline committees and things like that in school, or presidents and things like that. We're teaching kids, what does that mean? What does that entail? But we can broaden that a lot more than we do in schools, and ask kids, what kind of school do you want for yourselves? What kinds of practices do you think we should be enacting, and so forth? The critical literacy group in ours is sort of, what causes should we ask youth to talk about? What kinds of things should we embed our curriculum in? And then the teachers take those Common Core standards. They're not ignoring those. They don't get their jobs if they don't, right? And then weaving that in to the interests that the youth are naming. When schools do that, they're teaching youth that they are active members of society as well, and that these curriculum goals are there not just to be punitive, but to be in that much more organic sort of way. Thank you for listening.